Why is The Empire Strikes Back the best film of the original trilogy? Don't worry, Ezra, I'm not going to talk about Oppenheimer because I hear they did your great-great-grandfather Louis Strauss dirty in that movie, so we're going to stick to Star Wars today. Why is The Empire Strikes Back the best film of the original trilogy? I understand this may not be universally accepted, but most Star Wars fans consider it axiomatic. Now, there are a bunch of reasons that this is true, including the script, the world building, and the acting, which was stronger than the original. But the most compelling reason, I think, is that Empire begins in the middle of the saga and ends before the end. The second film is just that. It's a great middle film. It doesn't end with exploding Death Stars and victory parties. Rather, it challenges our sentimentality by insisting the story continue after the first Death Star is destroyed, reminding us that victory is often ephemeral and battles are not wars. And it ends not with a satisfying bang, but with an epic lightsaber duel, a wounded protagonist, and one of the greatest reveals in movie history: "No, I am your father." Empire is the messy middle of the Star Wars saga. Into it, the filmmakers pour love and conflict and betrayal and wisdom. It's the movie where we first meet not King Solomon, but Yoda. They pour struggle and they pour sacrifice. And if none of this resonates because you haven't seen the Star Wars film, as the Yiddish curse goes, you should grow like an onion with your head in the ground. Similar to The Empire Strikes Back, our Parsha 2 marks the messy middle of the Joseph saga. We meet our protagonist rotting in prison until Pharaoh has unsettling dreams that no one can interpret. In the first chapter of the story, Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery. His father told that he had been killed by a wild beast, but he is held captive, first by Ishmaelite slavers, and later by Potiphar. Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Joseph, who refuses her and for his defiance is imprisoned, he thinks perhaps forever. But Pharaoh's dreams and Joseph's ability to interpret changes everything. He's cleaned up, given a shave and a haircut, and thrust before the king. From here, the story takes a positive turn. Joseph is elevated to vizier and placed in charge of agricultural policy for all of Egypt. And that's how he comes to encounter his brothers once more. The famine in Canaan is so severe that they have no choice but to seek assistance from Egypt. So Joseph spends the remainder of our Torah portion toying with his brothers. And since this is the messy middle, the portion doesn't offer a resolution. Instead, as Ezra described, Benjamin is caught with Joseph's silver goblet, which of course Joseph had planted on him. The brothers are contrite, pleading for their lives, but in a last-ditch effort to play on their track record of betraying a brother, Joseph offers them an out. Ha'ish asher nimtza hagavia biado hu yeh li aved. Only the one in whose possession the goblet was found shall be my slave. The rest of you shall go back in peace to your father. When The Empire Strikes Back rolls credits, we don't yet know that Luke will ultimately resist Darth Vader's advances, that Vader will betray the Emperor, that the whole story has a redemption arc. Our Parsha ends similarly, leaving us to wonder, has Joseph become the enemy of the story, adopting a Pharaoh's malevolence? Has he succumbed to the dark side, as it were? Will the brothers repeat their sins, leaving Benjamin for dead and probably destroying their father Jacob for good? Will the old Judah show up, the one who suggested that they sell Joseph, who called for his own daughter-in-law's execution? Or will there be a nechemta, a rapprochement, a truce, a reckoning, a stable and lasting peace. Which brings me to the war between Israel and Hamas, which began with the massacre on October 7th and shows no sign of abating. We are now, and for the foreseeable future, in the messy middle of this conflict. And it's natural, I think, when we find ourselves in such a dark place to wonder what can or should be done differently, to question alliances, to find nearly inescapable our sense of betrayal or bewilderment. And with skyrocketing rates of anti-Semitism, they're up over 300% from last year, and last year was also bad. We're confounded, too, by those who seem hell-bent on judging before interrogating assumptions or refusing to make space for Jews within conversations about trauma, oppression, bigotry, and sexual violence. Israelis are clear about the necessity of this war, as are many, but surely not all American Jews, as are many, but surely not all Beth Amers. Here in the very messy middle, many of us are asking hard questions about Jewish security, Jewish power, Jewish pain, and trauma. We might be asking how we can trust this Israeli government to protect its people, an administration which has shown again and again this past year little regard for the majority of its own citizens' views, nor many of its minority populations. And what about the sheer contempt so many currently in power have shown to Palestinians in the West Bank? We might be wondering whether military brass so profoundly failed to recognize the signs of the coming storm, whose military apparatus showed up oh so slowly when the sirens sounded and while the world watched in horror, who cavalierly for months disregarded the advice of the Tatzpaniyot, women soldiers stationed on the border with Gaza, who sent warning signs again and again that Hamas was planning something terrible, but were ignored by men who had been conditioned to ignore women. We might wonder whether these generals can be trusted to prioritize the safety of women and children in Gaza as the bombs fall and the death toll rises. And even if we humbly acknowledge that we don't know the first thing about military strategy, about how to attain victory against a pernicious enemy in an urban setting, in an intractable conflict, our hearts, assuming that they haven't been entirely hardened like Pharaoh's, are breaking open. They break for our 129 remaining hostages, for our thousands of Israeli dead and wounded, for Gazan civilians who are dying in unimaginable numbers, for liberated Israelis who will carry forever the trauma of their horrific captivity, for more than 100 Israeli soldiers who have fallen in battle, including the nephew of one of our own Beth Am members last week, for the families of 3 hostages who were mistakenly killed by the IDF yesterday, shirtless and waving a white flag, it seems, for the revelation that Hamas was discovered to have been gassing Jews. That's right, gassing Jews in Kibbutz Nahal Oz, for Jewish communities here and around the world who have had menorahs and other property vandalized, as we saw with Baltimore Hebrew signage this week. Our hearts may be full of pride in a resilient Israel, but all of us, I think, our hearts are broken, wide open. And in this messy middle, they will not soon enough have time to heal. Yesterday, as you know, was the last day of Hanukkah. Dr. Alana Stein-Hain of the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem wrote a piece in the Times of Israel last week arguing that Hanukkah, too, is a story of the messy middle. Hanukkah reminds us that miracles are possible, she writes, and that seemingly unwinnable wars can be won. But it also holds lessons about partial victories, imperfect heroes, and incomplete belonging. The Hanukkah victory did not end the war between the Seleucid Greeks and the Maccabees. Military campaigns continued for years thereafter. Statecraft was employed as alliances were made and broken. Communities dedicated monuments to fallen heroes, and even the great Judah the Maccabee died in battle. In short, Hanukkah did not decisively conclude the saga. Rather, it marked a crucial milestone amidst continued sacrifice and uncertainty about the future. Hain goes on to remind us that Jewish civil war depicted in the book of Maccabees is not the full story, that the battles, as opposed to general divisiveness, were between those generally on the extremes, and that there was still a widespread sense of collective identity and shared destiny between the Jews of Judea and diasporic communities. What bound all these Jews together, as Professor Malka Simkovich has argued, was more powerful than what divided them. The messy middle is hard, because in the thick of it, we lack perspective only on the substantial passage, or rather, only that the substantial passage of time can provide. The fog of war is not restricted to the battlefield, but clouds so much of what's happening right now, doesn't it? It's hard to know what's what, who to talk to, who to trust, who to blame, and in the messy middle, there's a tendency to assign blame pretty quickly. There are those who insist Israel can do no wrong, that any attempt to speak to a broader context for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is justification of Hamas and anti-Semitic on its face. There are those who insist only Israel is to blame, that the very fact of Jewish presence and power between the river and the sea is the fundamental problem. But messiness breeds myopia, and to insist we are clear-eyed when the fog swirls between us is folly, and being far from the action, from decisions being made, from the daily violence and displacement, compounds the problem because we feel powerless and desperately want to feel otherwise. But that might be precisely why, even as we may take principled positions, we should be extra careful when we speak or post or chant or shun or shame. Perhaps our Torah is instructive here. In the Parsha, it takes a while before Joseph is able to trust his brothers enough to reveal himself to them. We have to wait until next week's Parasha for that. Maybe a lesson is that it takes time for the dust to settle. Once it does, however, we'll need to ask some hard questions about what happened before, on, and since October 7th. Here, the Rabbi's discourse about Hanukkah might be helpful. I suggested in the past that the prophets and the Rabbi's tendency to assign blame for our trauma to ourselves is corrosive. Taking responsibility is important, to be sure, but self-blame easily morphs into self-sabotage or, in extreme cases, self-hatred. But Dr. Joshua Kolb, who was here at Beth Am last Pesach, made an interesting point on a podcast with Yehuda Kurtzer this week. He argued that the reason the rabbis tend to blame us for things that happened to us during our history, including in the Hanukkah story, is also pragmatic. We can't really know what motivates others. But with enough reflection and internal debate, we can identify our own motivations. We can't fix the failings of others. But with enough humility, we can improve upon our own, to take responsibility for Jewish failures. With the benefit of time, the way the rabbis could, years after the Hasmonean Empire, is to consider deeply what it means to be a Jew in the world. And that project of meaning-making is the ultimate project of Jewishness. But perspective, now, is something hard, maybe impossible to have. A final text I learned this week from Rabbi Devin Maimon Villarreal. The text comes from the Talmud Yerushalmi. There are two Talmuds, one from Babylonia and one from the land of Israel, that was written down around the year 400 of the Common Era. And I'm holding it at this moment because it's a reminder of two paradoxical truths. First, that the messy, painful middle will end, that we won't be here forever. And second, that any ending of this chapter of our story is also the beginning of the next. Here's the text. B'shachar tzarich adam lomar modeh ani lefanecha. In the morning, one should say, I give thanks to you, God of my ancestors, that you brought me out of darkness to light. In the afternoon, one should say, I give thanks to you, God of my ancestors, that just as you gave me merit to see the sun rise in the east, I have also merited to see it set in the west. And in the evening, one should say, may it be your will, God of my ancestors, that just as I was in darkness, and you brought me out into light, so will you bring me from dark to light. Today is the day after Hanukkah, the day we might notice the stark contrast between the 8th night's fully emblazoned Chanukiot and the darkness of this winter season. But there is light to be found beyond the horizon. As I shared at our Clay Kodesh services last week, the days will soon become longer and the darkness will release its hold on us. And in the meantime, our task, difficult though it is, without better visibility, is to not give in to the dark, to simplistic dogmas and reductive platitudes. You know, there's actually a dark side in Jewish mystical tradition. I'm not kidding. The Sitra Achra, the other side. God is goodness, according to the Kabbalists. Maybe we don't believe in a force per se, but there are forces, there are dark forces that draw us away from that goodness. And Torah's insistence that we treat people with dignity and compassion, that challenge our capacity to remain patient when the answers are elusive. My prayer for us is that we not lose hope while we're awaiting and working for a better tomorrow. We cannot be an Or LaGoyim, a light unto the nations, if we cannot see the possibility of light in ourselves and in the world. To some, the answers are like a galaxy far, far away, impossible to find. To others, they are always readily apparent. But probably neither is true. What is true is that there is a God who cares enough to give us wisdom, patience, love, and with time, perspective. Shabbat Shalom.